A new field thus opens up for observation in the behavior of consciousness in its actuality. Psychology contains the collection of laws in accordance with which spirit relates itself in various ways to the various modes of its actuality as an otherness already given. On the one hand, spirit receives these modes into itself, conforming to the habits, customs, and way of thinking already to hand, as being that in which it is an actuality or as an object to itself. And on the other hand, spirit knows itself as spontaneously active in face of them, and in singling out from them something for itself. It follows its own inclinations and desires, making the object conform to it. In the first case, it behaves negatively towards itself as an individuality. In the second case, negatively towards itself as a universal being. According to the first aspect, independence gives to what is already there merely the form of self-conscious individuality as such, and as regards the content, remains within the general actuality already given. According to the second aspect, it gives the actuality at least a peculiar modification which does not contradict its essential content, or one even whereby the individual, qua particular actuality with a peculiar content, sets itself in opposition to the general actuality, an opposition which becomes wrongdoing or crime when it sets aside that actuality in a merely individual manner, or when it does this in a general way and thus for all, putting another world, another right, law, and customs in place of those already existing. Here in paragraph 302, Hegel is now telling us about a shift to observation of behavior of consciousness in its actuality. A shift in observation, which is self-observation, also observation of other people, of course, and then trying to correlate one's own behavior to those of others that have been observed. And what we're talking about are conscious beings in their actuality, no longer in the abstract, but in how they are, how they present themselves within the world, within the matrix of society. And we're observing behavior. We're observing how people actually behave, how they act, what they do. We're trying to think about motives. We're trying to think about what we can predict. And Hegel is laying out this duality now between what we could call the laws or the norms of some sort of observational psychology. Observational psychology not in the sense that we give it today, where we have departments of that, and it's a very demarcated discipline, separate from everything else, but as part of philosophy essentially. And then the individual. So this would include not only psychology, but also what we call political science, economics, anything that has to do with human behavior. Ethics would also fit in here, and I think that in this passage in particular, you can see Hegel grappling with, but also trying to go beyond the heritage of Kant and also Kant's immediate successors. So Hegel tells us that a new field opens up for observation. This is what that field is focused on. Psychology, says, contains a collection of laws in accordance with which spirit relates itself in various ways to the various modes of its actuality as an otherness already given. So what does that mean? Well, think about what spirit has meant for Hegel. This is the Phenomenology of Spirit, right? And there's a section, Spirit, further on beyond reason. But we've already seen spirit raise itself up as an issue, as you might say, a telos, something that we're aiming at, both in the preface and also in the self-consciousness section. There's been a lot of interesting discussion, sort of hinting at what's going on. And we're talking about a community. So reason has been this section in which we have the observing consciousness, looking at things, and also realizing that it is finding itself out there in the world of which it is reason, right? The world for which reason exists. Spirit now is going to have to do with the relationship of a consciousness with an other consciousness, but also with other consciousnesses. And this is one way in which it's making sense of that, an early way. So Hegel goes on and he says, psychology is providing us with one side of this. So he says, on the one hand, spirit receives these modes into itself, conforming to the habits, right, customs, way of thinking already at hand, as being that in which it is an actuality or an object to itself. What are we talking about here? What is the spirit? The individual, the person, is internalizing, is making part of themselves this larger social matrix of meaning not just in the sense of, well, this is a book, but in the sense of, this is a book and this should be acted upon in this particular way, and that's a good thing or a bad thing. All this firm tissue, we might say, of what's going to later be called substantial life, or the ethical. That's going to come up in the later in the reason section, and also very much in the spirit section. So the individual conforms to these habits, customs, ways of thinking, in a broader sense, laws, overarching norms. So, being an Athenian, for example, in ancient Athens after the democracy is established, doesn't preclude being an oligarch, but it means thinking that you have the right to present oligarchy as a viable option within the democracy that has been established, right? If you're in Sparta, well, you're dealing with a whole different set of laws governing that particular framework, governing that particular system. So on the one side, we have the individual as treating themselves as an object, making themselves understandable to themselves in terms of this matrix of norms. On the other side, we have something quite interesting, and this is where we have a dualism. He says, here we go. On the other hand, spirit knows itself as spontaneously active in the face of them. And in singling them out as something for itself, it follows its own inclinations and desires, making the object conform to it. What is the object? Well, we'll think about that in just a moment. But notice what he says, that the individual, who is spirit in this case, spontaneously active in the face of these laws. They're not just blind necessity that imposes itself upon a person. At a certain level, the person makes a choice or a series of choices to take on these laws. It goes beyond just that, though. It's not just an off-on. Singling out something for itself. What we're talking about here is what we could say is interpretive adaptation. These laws, the whole fabric of ethical life, as Hegel is later going to call it, we pick out what elements, we pick out what parts of it we want to appropriate for ourselves and understand ourselves within. So for example, professional life, right? I'm a doctor. That means that the things that apply to lawyers probably don't apply to me, but our social expectations of doctors and medicine in general, I take that on. But then I decide how I'm going to adapt that in my present circumstances. And Hegel talks here about following one's own inclinations and desires. And that's language almost straight out of Kant, right? We could say that what we have here are not heteronomy and autonomy, but rather two different kinds of heteronomy, right? The heteronomy of the individual following their inclinations and desires, and that of these, in certain respect, arbitrarily given, but then presented as necessary, social constraints, social norms, ways of understanding things that provide an intersubjectivity. And Hegel thinks this is all going on within every single individual within the social fabric. And that is part of what is going on in the development of spirit. Of course, the individual is probably not all that conscious of that, but that is what is happening. So he goes on and he says, here we go. In the first case, over here, Spirit behaves negatively towards itself as an individuality. Why? Because it subverts or subordinates its individuality. As an individual, it reduces its individuality so it can fit into the norms here. In the second case, negatively towards itself as a universal being. The universal being is yielded by this over here. I am an Athenian. I am a doctor. I am a 21st century middle-aged man, right? All those sorts of things. We're treating the universal as something that we, in certain respects, can depart from and dispense with. Now, Hegel says some really interesting things about this. So he says, according to the first aspect, independence gives what is already there merely the form of self-conscious individuality as such. Right? Here's the norms. You are self-conscious about it. Conform to the norms. Right? And then he says, as regards the content, remains within the general actuality already given. This is an actuality. Despite the fact that, in a certain respect, social norms exist everywhere and nowhere, they are an actuality. You don't find a person who doesn't have some internalized social norms. So we go on, and he says, according to the second aspect, it gives the actuality a peculiar, specific, its own personal modification which does not contradict its essential content, or one even whereby the individual, qua particular actuality with a peculiar content, sets itself in opposition to the general actuality. So it could be sort of a, hey, we've got these norms in place and I'm just going to find my place within them, and I'm happy because I adapt them to myself and I follow my inclinations and desires and everything's going great. Or there can be a conflict where the person is like, I'm not living with this sort of life. You're not going to tell me what to do. We actually have like a, in our society and within our, this shows you that there's some self-referentiality involved in these norms. We have a special time picked out for that, right? Adolescence. Screw you, man! You're not going to tell me what to do and how to live. Right? That's not actually how most adolescents behave, but there's some element to that, and then many of them continue that on into adulthood. But that's part of why, or part of how, the social conflict between the society with its norms and the individual adapting things can take place. He goes on a little bit further, and he says, there's two ways this opposition can happen. One of them is wrongdoing or crime. And this is what happens when the individual is in conflict with the overarching societal norms, and they're in conflict with it merely as an individual. I'm not going to respect property. I am going to walk across this guy's lawn, whether he likes it or not, whether the laws of the city tell me that I'm allowed to or not. I'm going to follow my inclinations and desires. And then you get arrested for trespassing, right? That's a crime. I'm not going to respect property. I'm not going to respect sexual integrity. I'm not going to respect life. As an individual, that means it's crime. Hegel says something else that is quite important here, though, as well. Something with, you might say, revolutionary implications. He says, when it does this in a general way, thus for all, putting another world, another right, law, and customs in place of those already existing, then what we have is no longer just a clash between the universal and the individual, but between the old universal and the new, more universal. And this is part of what happens through the progress in world history. That's where we see spirit in its development taking place, and we're going to see a lot of dynamics like that. We've already seen some like that before with the skepticism, Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness sections, but those were not really fully developed in that way. When they become social movements like that of the Enlightenment, that's when we have what Hegel is talking about here. Observational psychology, which in the first instance records its perceptions of the general modes coming to its notice in the active consciousness, comes across all sorts of faculties, inclinations, and passions. And since, while recounting the details of this collection, it cannot help recalling the unity of self-consciousness, it must at least go so far as to be astonished that such a contingent medley of heterogeneous beings can be together in the mind like things in a bag, or more especially since they show themselves to be not dead inert things, but restless movements. Here in paragraph 303, a very short paragraph, Hegel is just pointing out to us essentially one main issue, and that has to do with the way observational psychology finds itself working. Remember that we are the sort of riders along, watching consciousness make sense of its own attempts to come to terms with the totality of what it is studying and to find its truth. So this is a case where observational psychology, as a way in which consciousness is grappling with this project, is finding out that it doesn't really have the truth, or at least that there's a conflict here. So he says that observational psychology, and we ought to understand it not just as a discipline, but primarily as an activity that discipline would then somehow represent the results of, and a way of furthering, right? A way of adding to the stock of common ideas for humankind. So that observational psychology, in the first place, records its perceptions of the general modes coming to its notice in the active consciousness. And this is what we're trying to understand in terms of laws of consciousness, laws of thought, right? So how does that really play itself out when we get to something that's more concrete? Here Hegel talks about a whole mess, a whole swarm of heterogeneous faculties, inclinations, passions. We've already had some previous exposure to this in thinking about, as we were talking in the previous section, sensibility, irritability, reproduction. Now we're actually thinking in terms of faculties of the human being and their capacity for thinking or for feeling or for acting. We also had some discussion of this back in the self-consciousness section with the unhappy consciousness and the fact that these faculties were given to it by its other, which was the divine, but we're putting that aside for the moment. Now we're trying to study these through observing other people and through observing ourselves. Now what's the problem here? Hegel says that this is a contingent medley of heterogeneous beings. What does that mean? Well, think about it. This is a great, term, medley. It's got some connotations in English that I think are actually quite helpful here that aren't there in the original German. But I don't like medleys. I don't like to hear them because for me, we move from one song, a bit of one song, to another song, to another song. You never hear a whole song. Instead, you're hearing like the most popular 12 bars from that song. I actually hate listening to that sort of stuff, in part because I like things to cohere. Right? I don't want to just jump from thing to thing to thing. It's sort of like having a taste where they've piled in, every single taste flavor possible, and it changes, and then you're like, I've had enough of that. Give me something that I can sink my teeth into. And so that is what Hegel's talking about here. We've got this mess of stuff that psychology is observing. And remember, we're not just talking about psychology, we're talking about economics, political science, moral philosophy, this whole thing that has to do with the human being in action. What's the problem here? Hegel says that this, in some respects, contradicts something that we know about the human being. That is the unity of self-consciousness. He says, while recounting the details of this collection, it cannot help, what is it? Observational psychology, cannot help recalling the unity of self-consciousness. It must be astonished that these sort of things can all be in the mind like objects in a bag. Because the fact that self-consciousness is a unity means that these somehow need to be unified into a coherent system. And even more so, he says, since these things are not themselves dead, inert things, but restless movements. So the challenge here is to understand how all of this stuff actually fits together. Observation in recounting these various faculties is keeping to the universal aspect. The unity of these manifold capacities is the opposite aspect to this universality, the actual individuality. However, to take up again in this way the distinctive actual individualities and to recount that one man has more inclination for this, another for that, that one has more intelligence than another, all this is much less interesting even than enumerating the species of insects, mosses, and so forth. For these give observation the right to take them thus singly and uncomprehendingly, because they belong essentially to the element of contingent particularization. On the other hand, to take conscious individuality unintelligently as a manifestation that is single and separate involves a contradiction, since its essential nature is the universal of spirit. But since observation in apprehending it endows it with the form of universality, it finds its law and seems now to have a rational aim and to be engaged in a necessary activity. Paragraph 304 is picking up from this contingent medley, is, this whole bag of tricks, you might say, faculties, inclinations, passions, the things that we can use observational psychology to say something about, on the whole, about human beings. When we come up with generalizations, like, for example, one of the contemporary internet ones is similar to Gresham's law as far as currency, that bad currency drives out good. I forget exactly what the one is for the internet that says that bad data tends to swamp good data, as opposed to what we would normally think. Those are things about human behavior, right? And so we can come up with certain laws or rules or norms that function both in a descriptive and also a prescriptive way. And that's on the side of the universal, and on the other side we have individuality. And we talked about the problem that the unity of self-consciousness doesn't seem to quite fit with the fact that we have this whole, grab bag over here of stuff that the psychologists are focusing on. How is it that the human being is in fact a coherent, dynamic whole when the perspective that the psychologists are affording us is this, sort of partitioned off, compartmentalized being. So Hegel says here that observation in recounting these faculties is keeping to the universal aspect. And the opposite to this is the unity of the manifold capacities, the actual individuality. Now notice what he's going to do here. He says, but individuality isn't individuality all by itself. Individuality is individualities in the plural. You don't just have one individual. You couldn't talk about the social if all you had was one being, right? So he says, to take up again in this way the distinctive actual individualities and to recount that one man has more inclination for this, another for that. So what we're doing is we're looking at the individuals and now say we're measuring them with the metrics that have been yielded by study of this particular faculty or this particular inclination. Or as our psychologists like to say today, these correlations of dependent and independent variables, right? And we look at individuals in the light of that. Perhaps giving them inventories, having them take a survey, right? What's the balance of positive to negative emotions in your life? Why don't you track that over time? Well, Jimmy finds out one thing, and Susie finds out another thing, and Robert finds out another thing, and Hegel says, who cares? That's not interesting at all. Now that's an interesting thing by itself to say, isn't it? Does that mean Hegel's just sort of the equivalent of a psychological Philistine saying, oh, psychology, smychology, not interested in that? No. He says, all this is much less interesting even than enumerating the species of insects or mosses, for these give observation the right to take them singly and uncomprehendingly, because they belong essentially to the element of contingent particularization. When we're looking at species, there's a certain purpose to doing things that way. But he says, on the other hand, to take conscious individuality unintelligently as a manifestation that's single and separate involves a contradiction. Why? Its essential nature is the universal of spirit. What does that mean? This individuality, this individuality, this individuality, all of them are in fact spirit, just as much as the other. We don't have any one individual who is more of an individual than the others, at least at this point in time. So he says, observation in apprehending it endows it with the form of universality. That's over here. And it's producing some sort of law, right? It seems now to have a rational aim and to be engaged in a necessary activity. What is engaged in a necessary activity? Observation. Observation of individuality. So is this going to hold? And the question, we've been looking for law all this time. Great. What is that law going to be? The moments constituting the content of the law are, on the one hand, the individuality itself, on the other hand, its universal inorganic nature, that is, the given circumstances, situation, habits, customs, religion, and so on. From these, the specific individuality is to be comprehended. They embrace specific as well as universal elements and are at the same time something given, something which provides material for observation and which, on the other hand, expresses itself in the form of individuality. Paragraph 305 is very short, and there's really only one main thing being developed there, but there's some interesting implications that I want to call your attention to. So let's look first at what Hegel's actually saying. So he talks now about the law, right? And we weren't able to have a law for organic being, but now we want to have a law for observing consciousness. And he says that the moments constituting the content of the law are, on the one hand, the individuality, on the other hand, the universal inorganic nature. What is that inorganic nature? Well, he tells us that it's these givens, right? Circumstances, the situation, habits, custom. Notice he talks about religion, too. This is a time when people are more religious, but it's still a major force in our own time. And we often think that if we know something about, this background material, or where somebody was raised, or what sort of ideological things are floating around in their environment, that we know a lot about them. That we can generalize and say that the specific individuality can be comprehended in terms of these things, right? Oh, you're a Catholic? Well, then you must think this way. I mean, nobody who actually spends any time within the Catholic Church thinks that to be the case, because you very quickly encounter a diversity of opinion and perspective, and it's that way with many other religions, churches and religions as well. We can also say this about political standpoints. We can say this about being educated. Oh, you went to an Ivy League school, you must be an elitist. Well, no, I mean, at the Ivy Leagues, they often teach this sort of egalitarianism that doesn't often trickle down into actual egalitarianism, but that's the makeup. But what's to say that person who went to that place isn't going to be the exception to the norm? That's not being considered here. What's going on is we're saying, yeah, as observational psychologists, we can look at this stuff over here, and then we can make sense out of the individuality. Because the individuality is really an expression of all of this stuff over here. Now, what are the implications of this? Where have we seen this discussion of one thing, one moment of a law being the expression of another? Does that seem to bring back to mind the outer is the expression of the inner that we've heard so much in the past, right? Now it's no longer outer and inner. As a matter of fact, this is more the inner in certain respects because it's got interiority, and this is the outer, this is what we can observe. But it's still about expression. It's still about a sort of reductionism, about saying, well, because we understand this, and we don't really even understand this, but we pretend like we do, we now know everything about the individual. Is that really the case? We're going to see that this is an interesting line, and think about how prevalent this is in our own time. People making all sorts of predictions, people making all sorts of accusations about who and what another person is, and what sort of standpoint they must have, and whether they can understand certain experiences, or even say certain words, and we can go on and on. A lot of that is based on this notion of what we could call social determinism. You know something about the social matrix, you know the individual. Hegel is going to combat that. One of the other key implications of this is when you hear people saying, oh, Hegel thinks that history is just this massive determinism and nobody can do otherwise than they're doing. Everybody's just sort of stuck and there's no real freedom. This is one of those paragraphs where human freedom is coming to the fore as something that, is not going to allow itself to be reduced merely to social facts.